The development sector proclaims that it values dignity, yet it often breaks this promise, with people leaving encounters with charities feeling bruised and unseen. In this podcast, IDIS Research Fellow Marina Apgar is in conversation with Tom Wein from the IDinsight Dignity Initiative, who examines dignity as a core value around the world, drawing on his in-progress research for the future book, Lives of Dignity. Tom explores how dignity serves as both a universal human value and a practical principle for improving development outcomes, and offers compelling evidence that dignity matters deeply to people worldwide.
Welcome, everybody. So Tom is director at IDinsight, where he leads the Dignity Initiative. And this is work that he's been doing over many years, 10 at least.
Almost 10, I think.
Almost 10 or so. He was, prior to being at IDinsight, he spent some time in Uganda, and he spent many years in Nairobi, Kenya. He's also a co-author of the book Marketplace Dignity with Kate Lamberton and with Neela Saldana. And he's currently working on a new book, which is what we get to hear some reflections about today. So Tom and I met a few months ago because we're both involved in a collaboration on the Full Spectrum Coalition, which is an evidence and learning initiative with a group of partners working on community-led development. And one of the things that I've really appreciated in our interactions around that, but also hearing you talk with such passion about this work on dignity, is that you have over years been looking at mountains, I would say, of evaluation and research data from work that you've done in many different contexts. And so that brings to it, I think, a very real sense of what the evidence is saying. So, and from that, then actually building up your theorizing, which is what you'll be sharing some of today. I also really appreciate that in the Dignity Initiative, you're not just doing the thinking about dignity and how important it is or how we frame our work around that, but you're actually pushing people to think about their own practice and helping us think about what's the relevance of this work to what we're doing, what we do here at IDS. So yeah, I think I will hand over to Tom to get us moving.
That's good. Hello, folks. Thank you so much for having me, Marina. Thank you for the generous introduction. This idea of dignity is one of those ideas that development people like to talk about a lot. It's the first few words in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are about dignity. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, when he gave his inauguration speech, one of the sort of core lines of it was, "Human dignity is the core of my work." All these people who we look to as leaders on development keep coming back to this idea. It keeps showing up in report titles and so on. And yet, you don't see a lot of programming decisions made on the idea of dignity. It doesn't really, its importance in rhetoric doesn't really seem to be reflected in the practice of development. And that matters, I think, because when you go much wider than that and ask the people who are served by development, actually when you ask people all over the world, when you do these cross-cultural studies, as we've been able to do in India and Nigeria and the United States, and another academic, formerly of Oxford, Mansour Lalji, did comparative work in India and Northern Ireland and Dubai, and across these places, people really care about dignity. It really matters to people, both when we ask them in qualitative research, why does this matter to you? People say, it matters to me enough that I'd be willing to pay costs to make sure that my dignity is respected. And so it seems to me, therefore, that there's this sort of broken promise when it comes to dignity. We're talking about this, and we're not really following through. When you look at the latest round of Afrobarometer data, they look at public service interactions all across Africa. They're looking specifically at health, security and public security and policing, and education, and obtaining documents is the fourth one. And across all of those, about a third of public service interactions, people report as being disrespectful. We can come on to more about why that might matter in terms of other metrics and outcomes and other things that we might care about in development later on. But for now, let's just take the values reason. People who lead development say they care about it, and the democratic reason. The people who development serve say they care about it. Scholars certainly seem to care about it. A lot gets written about dignity. This classification of different stages of evidence borrows from work by Evan Lieberman. He has this lovely paper about different stages of evidence and how to categorize them. It's just one of those incredibly useful things for all types of research. And we have loads of theoretical and normative studies, loads of philosophy, loads of legal studies, loads of people explaining, this is what I think about dignity, this is what this text thinks about dignity. We have a fair number of descriptive studies, some really interesting qualitative work about this is what these people living in this situation think about dignity. We've got slightly fewer, but a reasonable number of what Lieberman classifies as early stage experiments that might be taking place in laboratory conditions, experiments to study psychological questions, often in the United States. We have many fewer of what Lieberman calls late stage experiments, so studies of real world attempts to change whether people feel their dignity has been respected. And there's really very little associational quantitative survey work, really very, and I don't think anybody's tried natural experiments. I'm not surprised that that's true, but I think certainly these ones, it feels like there could be a bit more, and we're a little bit unbalanced. This book, the Cambridge Handbook of Human Dignity, is a fantastic book. It's an absolute treasury of all of this theoretical and normative work. So many different understandings, as like 60, 70 essays. It's huge, this thing, with this is what the Buddhist idea of dignity is, and this is what the classical Hindu idea of dignity is, and this is how dignity is viewed in early Christian thought and Middle Ages Christian thought and so on, and different Enlightenment thinkers. It's a really wonderful book. It's such a treasury, but it is firmly in this tradition. That has been the main way that people have explained how dignity varies. They've done it by theoretical tradition, theological or philosophical tradition. They've said this tradition says this scholar says that. The other main way that we see through a lot of these descriptive studies is essentially variation by country. People say, this is the South African or Southern African tradition of dignity. There's a wonderful series of papers from the Overseas Development Institute, their humanitarian policy group a few years ago, led by Kerry Holloway, did this series of brilliant qualitative papers on the experience of refugees of dignity and how they understood it. And I'm compressing those papers. There's lots of nuance in there, but they tend to come down to, this is how Colombian IDPs think about dignity. This is how, and then others have said, this is how Americans think about dignity. And this attempt to categorize it by country. So we've got categorization by philosophical tradition, categorization by country. And then there's a few other attempts to explain how dignity varies. One of them, or even just to categorize and describe how dignity varies. One of them is the sort of medical approach to this, which is essentially to give up and say, this is our definition of dignity, this is what dignity is, and just to keep importing it across countries with minor changes to how they ask the survey questions. One of them, there's an essay by a sociologist called Geza Lindemann, who says that it's all about individualism versus collectivism. And individualistic societies have this idea of dignity, and collectivist societies have this idea of dignity. Intriguing to explore. It's one essay, she doesn't take it much further than that. And then there's a line of work from cultural psychology, scholars like Dov Cohen and Angela Lung. Cohen and Lung have this lovely paper together where they look at this idea of cultural syndromes, is what they call it. And they say some societies are dignity societies, and some societies are honor societies, and others are face societies. And this is like trying to say this is the most important value in this society versus that society. I like that work. It's one of the really nice things they do is that they allow room for rebellion. So they say this is the big idea that people in North America arrange their society around is dignity. Even if you're rebelling against that, you're still organizing yourself around that assumption. It's really interesting work. They've got some lovely empirical work to support it. But we've got all of these try to come up with try to assign these traditions of dignity or these ideas of dignity to a place. Now, that's not wrong, because place is really important in people's experience of dignity. When you run cross-sectional analyses, when you do regressions of surveys in the Afrobarometer data, in other surveys that we've conducted, the most significant predictor of people's experience of whether they were treated in a way that respected their dignity, the most significant predictor, therefore, of prevalence of respect or disrespect, is indeed place. More important than gender, more important than socioeconomic status, more important than urban-rural placement, is this thing about where do you live? That seems to really affect controlling for lots of other things, everything we could think of that seemed sensible to control for, that seemed to keep affecting people's experience of dignity. So place is important, but when you start doing qualitative work in some of these places, as we've been doing over recent years, you find that the idea is just much more ragged than that. And in fact, in scholarship on dignity, you get a lot of invective about the idea of dignity. Academics can be very rude in private, but when they're naming their papers, they tend to be quite cautious and conservative. But there are paper titles that are dignity is a useless concept, dignity is a vacuous concept. People who really feel very strongly that just give up. It's so complicated trying to capture dignity. Because when you ask people about it, they don't neatly follow those country boxes that we were looking at before. They don't neatly follow the philosophical traditions that are supposed to be assigned to them. When you move from theoretical work to social science work, to qualitative work in particular, it all gets much messier. The one philosopher calls dignity a multivocal concept. And by that he means that when we say the word dignity, we kind of invoke several traditions all at once. People are not specific about what they mean. They just mean a sort of cluster of things. I think that's a nice way of saying something similar. I'm certainly not on the side of the people who are saying dignity is a useless concept. It seems to me to have immense power, but it's certainly tricky to figure out. So what I want to do one of the things I want this book that I'm working on, Lives of Dignity, to do, one of the things that I want to do in this talk is to propose another way of categorizing different traditions of dignity, not by assigning them to a philosophical tradition per se, or to a country, although I'll try and note as we go where they have been particularly discussed, but just trying to note where dignity lies or resides in different places. And I think there's four big places that people talk about across these different traditions. One is inside a person, in a sort of ethereal spark of personhood. One is outside the person, in their standing in society, their merit or their status or their capabilities. One is in their physical body, and one is beyond them, in their relationships or the community that they're part of, or in something else beyond the individual person. So let's start with inside you, sort of inside your heart. One academic at the University of Notre Dame who I love collaborating with on this work is a guy called Paul Perrin. And I really like his definition. This is the closest to my definition. A lot of what I'm trying to do is observe all this variation, but at some point you've got to pin yourself a little bit to a definition, even if as tentatively as possible. So when I do so, this is the one that just sits best with me. So Paul and his colleagues say, human dignity is the inherent value that every individual possesses equally by virtue of being a human being, independent of one's abilities, characteristics, or actions. Respect for human dignity is acknowledgement of that inherent value by individuals, institutions, and society. So this tradition is the one that often gets called Kantian dignity, although there's lots of detailed debate that we won't go into in here about exactly how much Kant meant that. He himself was using it in a more ragged and uneven way than it's traditionally been treated. And it says two things. It says, everybody has dignity no matter who they are or how they have acted. And because they have dignity, they must be respected. They must be treated in a certain way. So we've got this inalienable dignity, no matter who you are, no matter what you've done. And because of that, there's this basic level of respect. We might show more respect to people who've done amazing things. We'll come on to that in a moment. But it says everybody has it. And it focuses mainly on humans, but I guess you could draw your circle however you like, but everybody has it. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this seems to be roughly what they're getting at. When that first line, that introductory line of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being drafted, there became really hot debate with all these representatives from different parts of the world about what they meant by dignity. And eventually, they just sliced off the second half of the sentence where they were going to explain what they meant by dignity. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was chairing it, just said, enough, we're just going to say human dignity and we can all get on board with that ambiguity. But it seems to be that this sort of stuff about rights, this sort of stuff is what people are talking about when they talk about the underpinning of human rights. It's also very often described as the Western idea of dignity. And there's certainly the case that you can trace this idea of dignity, a heritage of this idea of dignity, through a number of Enlightenment scholars, a number of Renaissance scholars. There's a philosopher in America called Remy Deebs who wrote Dignity, A History. He does a wonderful job of doing that. But actually, when you move into this more qualitative work, you see this idea popping up a lot. A lot of people say, you've got to treat people right. A lot of people say, you've got to show respect to people no matter who they are. That's a very common thing all over the world. And so it's by no means only there, even if it's not a bad shorthand to talk about it as the Western idea of dignity. The second one that is really common in many Western countries, but really common in a lot of places, is the idea of dignity being on the outside of people. So this is a sort of summary quote from the second Voices of the Poor report, which must be 20-something years old now, but it's still a really cool resource. So they were summarizing what a lot of people had said about dignity in their work, and they said self-respect and dignity, as described by poor people, means being able to live without being a burden to others, living without extending one's hand, living without being subservient to anybody, and being able to bury dead family members decently. And so that is not the same as everybody has dignity no matter what. That's more like you've got dignity if you meet some criteria. And this idea of dignity is, again, one a lot of people subscribe to. People say you only have dignity if you carry yourself in a certain way, or that person who's in that terrible situation still carries themselves with dignity. They're sort of implying that, well, if they didn't carry themselves that way, they would be without dignity. This is an idea of status and merit. I really like the word. There's one scholar called Robert Fuller who talks about this as rankism, the idea of that everybody's on a rank and below certain level, you're without dignity. That can easily be applied to all sorts of hierarchical ways of sorting society, whether that's social class, and there's been lots of work about how the idea of dignity, when it's discussed in the 19th century in Europe, means aristocrats is a dignity of a certain rank, and then as we became more universalist and more egalitarian in the 20th century, or as political society did, we just sort of added a load of people into that aristocratic class. We didn't really change what we meant, we just upgraded everybody to that class. It's also, though, so there's lots about European aristocrats in here, but it's also kind of the idea that Martha Nussbaum is talking about when she starts saying dignity is about what capabilities you have. It's also the idea that some of the refugees interviewed in Syrian refugees interviewed in Lebanon by Kerry Holloway and the Overseas Development Institute, in the Philippines as part of that same project, IDPs in Mindanao in the Philippines, when they talk about self-reliance, this Voices of the Poor idea, they're all talking about this idea that you only sometimes have dignity. And both of these coexist really easily. Even I, for all that I study this all day and I try and talk about it with such care and precision, even so, I constantly kind of mean both of these. And when other people are saying, oh yeah, well, we should give people dignity through this aid project, I sort of know what they mean. It doesn't feel quite right. I don't like it, but it's a direction I'm tempted to go down as well. The third idea is that dignity lives not in the personhood, not in something, it lives in something physical. So this is a quote from Frantz Fanon from Black Skin, White Masks. I took myself far off from my own presence, far indeed, and made myself an object. What else could it be for me but an amputation, an excision, a hemorrhage that spattered my whole body with black blood? For Fanon, and for a tradition of writers on Black liberation in both Africa and America and Europe, building on ideas by W.E. Du Bois, and this idea of like the main threat to our dignity is physical, is the assaults that we face, and therefore dignity must implicitly lie there, is really important. And yet it's also one that's been picked up by movements for feminist liberation, and the discussion of bodily autonomy, and really constantly asserting that it is in our physicality that dignity lies, in the ways our bodies are treated. And so I said earlier that medicine has often been very universalist in the way it's talked about dignity. But when you compare the work on dignity by medical people working on end-of-life care and intensive care versus the work on dignity by medical people working on maternal health, you see in the maternal health scholars a lot more focus on the body. And then I want to talk just finally about a fourth one. The idea that there's something going on beyond the individual. And there's a lot of different versions of this. The most common that gets talked about is Ubuntu. Ubuntu is often asserted as this idea that dignity really lives in the relationships between people. It's not that Marina has dignity or that I have dignity, but the dignity lives somewhere in between us. That is also often characterized as a uniquely South African or Southern African approach to dignity. There has not been as much social science work with ordinary South Africans about what they think of the idea of Ubuntu as I would love to see. But certainly that is an important idea to a lot of people. It has a sort of popular currency. And yet there's a number of very prolific philosophers writing on the idea of Ubuntu. Thaddeus Metz really argues strongly that this is what Ubuntu is. It's this unique Southern African idea of that dignity lives in the relationships. I'm simplifying here, but somebody who's debated a lot with him is Motsamai Molefe, and he has tended to say, yes, we have Ubuntu, but we also have this concept of Umuntu, which, as I understand it, and this is right at the edges of anything I'm qualified to comment on, or perhaps beyond, is much more about individual personhood. Is much more like our first idea. And so the South African idea of dignity is not neat, and actually lots of writing on South Africa by Southern Africans. So if you look at Bessie Head's writing, for instance, there's one critic takes a look at Bessie Head's writing and sees in it a lot of work on the idea that people achieve dignity through fulfilling certain capabilities and graduating into full adulthood, full humanity. So there's this sort of complicated, messy idea. There's something about relationships, but people are not simple about the way they talk about it. For others, there's this idea of dignity living not in the individuals, but in the community. Again, there's probably a kind of a bit of both going on. People who are very communal still care somehow about individuals, but ideas of the dignity lives in the group. That is the repository of it. And then there's whole extensions beyond this, huge amounts of work going on about which I confess I have less, perhaps I ought to have more to say on it, but the idea that, well, yes, humans might have dignity, but there's also all these other beings that have dignity, maybe animals or angels or genies or all these different things. Maybe you look at ideas of animism and ways in which different environmental features might have dignity. Robert McFarlane has just published this book called Is a River Alive? About all the political work that is going on to assign rights to forests or rivers, and so there's a whole range of variety of things going on about dignity being beyond you. The way to tear ourselves out of this is not to try and decide. I think one helpful thing we can do is reflect on where we feel individually a state of peace. Donna Hicks talks about the idea of dignity as being this state of peacefulness. And so for each individual, maybe they feel one or several of these, maybe they feel particularly at peace when they're on their own, feeling secure in themselves. Maybe they feel particularly at peace or particularly satisfied when they are reflecting on their achievements and their material goods and the house they've finally been able to buy or something like that. Maybe we feel as individuals particularly at peace when we are moving our body, when we've just exercised, when we're in the water or something like that. Maybe we feel particularly at peace when we're embraced and with a community. And probably for all of us, we feel a couple of those or feel warm about a few of those. But I think that's about as far as we can go. And certainly as I'm working on this book, I'm going to try and keep moving back and forth between I feel perhaps most sympathetic personally, individually, to that first definition. But lots of people feel strongly about this, and almost nobody feels singly about any one of these. A few years ago, we convened a group of scholars to talk about the idea of dignity and where the research ought to go. And we came up with these 5 questions that we think ought to guide the research agenda. I've been talking today a lot about the first one. It may be perhaps in questions that we want to talk about any of the others of these. There's lots of interesting work to be done across this whole research agenda. But for now, I would love to hear what people think. This is something you can hear that I'm still working out for myself. Hopefully gonna write it all up. So really looking forward to your questions and reflections, and thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Tom. Very well timed. And yeah, really interesting to hear of those sort of the grappling with the complexity of it. I often think that when there is such complexity in a concept, it's we're onto something, right? But as you were talking, I was thinking a little bit about this idea of the sort of the first view of dignity and the more kind of individual, perhaps Western, although not only, and the idea of the more relational. And that's something that in the work we do here, particularly around trying to understand community-led development or participatory processes of development, we talk often of agency, right? And we think about that both in terms of the critical consciousness and self-efficacy ideas of agency, but then also collective agency and ability to take sort of collective action. And a bit like you said, it's not either or, right? It's probably both and. But it does raise quite big questions about that second point of measurement and how, if you are using this as a concept to understand what development can achieve, how do you deal with that? And I know that you've done a lot of work on thinking about how to measure dignity. So maybe you could reflect on how those 2 particular views, how they then influence what your evaluation or measurement agenda becomes.
When we're looking at what practically should we do about all of this, I started with this broken promise in development. And by that, we don't mean that we ought to be using the right words per se. We mean that services are delivered or absent in ways that are harmful to people, that people go hungry or go without medical care or are harmed by medical care. Therefore, a lot of this should focus on practicalities. When we're debating practicalities, a frequent conversation partner about the practicalities of this are the people at the agency fund. And obviously for them, their big concept, the big thing they like to talk about is agency. And for me, it's dignity. And yet when we're making recommendations, we often find ourselves making quite similar recommendations. I think both these ideas often are guiding us towards parallel ideas about what you can do in the world, because there's only a certain number of recommendations you can make that organizations are capable of digesting. At some point, you end up recommending training or adjustments to performance or messaging by management, or there's only a certain number of ways of moving a bureaucracy. Obviously, one of the great ways of moving a bureaucracy is measurement, is getting to pay attention to different metrics. I think there are 2 big approaches that have been taken in attempting to construct measures of dignity, and both of them have a big flaw. The first attempt to do this is what I would roughly associate with medical work on dignity. I said earlier, people working on medicine have tended to fix to a particular definition of dignity. Different scholars have had their different ones. Often it's been based on some very thoughtful theoretical works and good grounded theory stuff, but then they have picked it and fixed it and say, this is our definition of dignity. And when you look at the measurement options that they offer, the surveys that they offer, they tend to be these things that they are asked of the patient, but they could almost be filled out by an observer. They're kind of objective things. They're behaviors. Did the doctor do this? Yes or no? That gives you something quite practical that you can rely on, and there's not so much like uncertainty about did it happen or not, but it has no room for anybody else's definition of dignity. It takes, this is our definition of dignity, was it fulfilled or not? Were people treated with respect in the way we would define it or not? And then the other big tradition of measurement, sorry, I'm going on a bit about this, but the other big tradition of measurement is this one about subjective dignity. And that's the one I've tended to be keener to do because I work across different countries and different definitions. And so I want to ask questions that are along the lines of, were you treated in the way you feel you ought to be treated? And that allows lots of room for people to bring their own definitions of how they ought to be treated and what respect and dignity means to them. The big flaw with that one is what gets called in the literature adaptive preferences or the expectations problem, that what you might end up doing is paying the most attention, making programmatic decisions based on these outraged people who felt they were treated very disrespectfully, but that's because life has taught them to have very high expectations of how they ought to be treated. And so you might end up moving all your program and resources to try and mollify the wealthiest people in your program, while you might well get responses from people who have very great needs who say, well, were you treated as you expect to be treated? And they shrug their shoulders and say, yeah, it was no worse than normal. I'm usually badly treated, and this was, it was fine. And that would mean that you'll end up focusing, you're not using a sort of poverty focus, you're moving your attention away from the people who perhaps need the most help. So you should never, although I like these subjective measures, you should never just look at that. You should always be looking at the subjective measure plus some way of breaking it down, some way of zooming in on the experiences of people or subgroups that you're most interested in. Even that's not a full resolution of that problem, but I think those are the two big ways that people have approached it.
Is dignity something that we can support people to develop for themselves? So is it like self-confidence? So, because you have talked a lot about the service delivery, right? And the respect that's offered to people. So this connects a bit to what was sort of coming up in my mind around agency or critical consciousness building, like the extent to which if dignity is something that is within us and is in the body, then is that something that can be activated from within as well? So that's one question. And then maybe the final one, you touched upon it a little bit, I think, with MasterCard Foundation. But it's what has been your experience from philanthropists when you talk about dignity and the work that they fund? So people funding, is that a different experience? Right. So yeah, a few minutes to answer those.
Yeah. On this first question about whether we can do more to help people feel their dignity, of course, as I said, I feel closest to that first definition of they have dignity already. But maybe there's something we can do to raise their expectations so they don't so that we don't fall into that expectations trap in the subjective measures. Maybe there's something we can do to help them put that at the forefront or care about it. I would tend to think of those things as closer to critical consciousness raising. And so I'm more inclined to say it's already there. It would be good for the world if more people talked about it and noticed it. It would be especially good for the world if more people who hold power and are making decisions were more deferential to people's dignity. But it's, I think, it's, I think 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 it's perhaps more morally important to ensure that, and perhaps it's a path to getting those in power to care about it, that ordinary people are caring about this. There are also many ways in which we one-on-one fail to respect the dignity of each other, and we may hope that by bringing this to the forefront that we reduce some of that interpersonal disrespect. So I think always very careful in the way I talk about it to not talk about how can we give people dignity, but there must be loads of stuff we can be doing in our actions in the world around the dignity concept, or inspired by or in alignment with the dignity concept. One of those, I talked about people with power. Clearly, philanthropic foundations are central to driving, at the very least, innovation in international development, or newer or on the edge approaches. And increasingly, as governments seem to give up on their duty to do this work, or as rich countries seem to default on their obligations to do so, they become also funders of the bulk of the mainstream work. There has been, I think, quite a lot of positive response when I've been working with philanthropic foundations on this. So we worked with a number recently with the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, with the Wellcome Trust, with GiveWell, and they've all seemed quite, they've valued this idea of dignity. One particular case study that perhaps is worth mentioning is the organization The Life You Can Save. Not a classical foundation, and they do not have some endowment that they distribute, but rather people give them money, they decide which charities to pass it on to, and they do a lot of research and a lot of thinking about which charities they respect the most and so on. They have always, when you applied to become a charity that would receive funds from them, you had to demonstrate how many people you were reaching, and that you were doing it very cost effectively, and you're doing it in a way where you would keep on learning about your approach. About a year ago, any new charity who wanted to become recommended by The Life You Can Save also had to start justifying the ways in which they would respect the dignity of the people they're serving. And that's now, this year, being extended, as I understand it, to all of the existing charities that they've long recommended they will also have to account for that. Charities will not necessarily in the first round be kicked off the group just for not quite knowing how to answer that question on a form, but they'll have to justify it, and then they'll be given some resources and advice about the types of practices that the organizations that are doing well on affirming dignity seem to embody, and whether there are things they could introduce to that.
It's wonderful that you can bring so many concrete examples. Your sort of wealth of understanding, both of the conceptual and sort of theoretical side of this, but also what's going on in the practice, I think is really wonderful. So thank you for all of that. So I think we can probably start wrapping up. I wonder how we bring together some of the thinking that we've done around understanding participatory processes, building collective action, etc., critical consciousness, and your work on dignity. And I wonder how conceptually we bring those things together in that work. So I'm sure we'll keep talking about that.
Thanks for listening. Please like, subscribe, and share to help us spread the word. Do you have a feature that you would like to appear in a future episode? If so, then email betweenthelines@ids.ac.uk.